Well, hey there, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, I'm your faithful host, Josh Burtram. Our political host couldn't be here, but welcome to another episode of the Faithful Politics Podcast, where we talk to all sorts of experts and interesting people about the things that are happening, intersection of faith and politics, and just different ideas out there that intersect with that. And so today, I'm super excited actually to have L. Daniel Hawk. He is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Ashland Theological Seminary and an ordained United Methodist minister. He's written widely on biblical narrative, conquest texts like Joshua, and the way Scripture has been used to shape moral imagination in public life. His newest book is Undoing Manifest Destiny, Settler America, Christian Colonist, and the Pursuit of Justice. And that's what I'm talking to him about today. So thank you and welcome to the show, Dan. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much, Josh. And thank you for your interest in the book.
Absolutely. And, manifest destiny, I always heard that growing up, and I actually heard it as a good thing, right? It almost like, hey, it's manifest destiny. We felt like we were here. It was this mission that maybe if it wasn't divine, because I grew up in Fairfax County, so they're pretty liberal. They're not going to talk about divine, Fairfax County, Virginia, which is right outside of DC. And so, but there was this sense of American excellence, and this is our destiny, and we're moving. And for those who haven't heard or thought about that term since ninth grade history class, what is manifest destiny? What's the policy? What's the ideology and theology even? And why should we care about it?
Oh, well, okay. Great place to start.
We're just jumping right in, Dan.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so manifest destiny technically originally was associated with a kind of a conversation that was going on as the United States was contemplating expanding into Texas and so on and so forth. And a journalist by the name of John O'Sullivan kind of coined the phrase, and everybody seemed to really go with it. So, but it's taken on, I think, it's taken on a way of encapsulating the basic thread of American national mythology, which is this idea that whether by divine intention or whether by the inexorable course of human progress, the United States has a particular destiny to overspread and develop a nation and develop a civilization that will be for the good of all humanity by virtue of developing liberty and democracy and prosperity and all of these things. And that destiny is manifest by the fact that the United States was just able to expand inexorably across the continent.
Just keep going. They weren't stopped.
Yeah, and a matter of fact, once they got all the way to the West Coast, they didn't stop there. I mean, they kept going, and
Hawaii, Alaska
Hawaii was one, Philippines was another, and
yeah, that's right.
Anyway, yeah,
we kept going. So that idea that it is in the Americans' destiny to essentially keep going. And of course, at the time, there was the divine impetus behind it. Can you talk about, or like what was interpreted as divine impetus,
right? Which
is a big part of what your book is about, undoing manifest destiny, right? So clearly the idea is this was ill-fated, not well, definitely not matching with the ethics of Scripture that we understand them. And yet God was brought into this from the beginning. So can you kind of explain how that happened, why God was brought into this and why that's problematic?
Yeah, well, in a quick, in a quick soundbite, I mean,
yeah, we'll dig in more to all of it.
Yeah. So manifest destiny, that concept really begins with the first Pilgrim and Puritan colonists who arrive on these shores with a sense that God has brought us here God has brought us here to establish Christian colonies, Christian commonwealths. And so there's already this sense that that European English colonialism in particular is something that God is using, and using people essentially to tame the wilderness. So when the Puritans came and they looked at the land around them, what they saw was wilderness, wild place, and they saw people who lived under the domain of Satan. And so the idea is they just developed this idea, and it's connected to Genesis 1:28, where God gives a mandate to all humanity to be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. And there are two planks to this. One is called the Doctrine of Discovery, which is a body of international law that develops out of some papal bulls that basically said any Christian power, Christian leader, potentate, by virtue of being Christian, has the right and perhaps even the mandate to subdue non-Christian peoples and nations, to expand Christendom. You've got that, and then you've got this idea, this interpretation of Genesis 1:28 that the English Puritans had as they came to these shores, and which basically said God has given a mandate to all humanity to be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. And they understand subduing the earth as, in a sense, getting rid of the wilderness, which was wild and under the domain of Satan, and imposing or replenishing a kind of an Edenic, ordered land. So transform the land from this wilderness under the domain of Satan to a restoration of Eden, in which you put fences up, you turn it into property so that it could be a source of wealth and generate, and so on and so forth. So those two planks serve as basically theological cover for just a really atrocious program of colonization, justified violence, because indigenous peoples, with respect to the creation mandate, they're resisting. They're not obeying what God told all humankind to do. Let's just look at the land. Or they're resisting. And the idea that they were resisting the progress of this destiny, particularly into the 1800s, becomes a really strong argument for removing them, assimilating them, erasing their cultures, erasing their identity, because they're really resisting the command of God. And if you think of it in secular terms, they're resisting the onset of progress, what this kind of social evolution in which the United States is evolving into the highest culture and civilization in the world, so that we can help everybody else attain the kind of prosperity and freedom and liberties and values that we hold.
Yeah, I really appreciate that explanation, and I would really love to dig into what was their logic from Scripture? I mean, you were talking about it and alluding to it, but I'd love to go into more detail on how did they justify, like, for instance, in these papal bulls in the Doctrine of Discovery, again, to the degree that you're able, like, I don't want to assume that you have like read all of those or reviewed everything that's come from there. To the degree that you're able, like, what was their justification for, like, the Doctrine of Discovery? How did they, what method did they use, or like logic from theologically to get to that place that they felt like they could do that?
Yeah, well, it actually started with some papal bulls in which two popes basically, on the basis of their position as the vicar of Christ, so God's representative on earth, they had the full authority to issue these bulls. So a papal bull is like a decree and they started with actually bulls to the Portuguese and then later to the Spanish, but basically where popes said to them, we give you the authority by virtue, in order to advance Christianity, we give you the authority to subdue, to conquer any non-Christian people or land. The third bull added the idea of discovery. So any people or land that is discovered, we will, you have full authority. And that kind of morphs into the idea that any Christian power, any Christian potentate, by virtue of being Christian,
just because they're Christian,
has the authority. So a Christian king has the authority to, again, just to go in and take lands that are not Christian. And that particular element finds its way into federal law with some Supreme Court decisions in the early 1820s. So that's the justification there, because it starts off with the Pope saying, I have full authority, and that's in the mid 1400s. But then, of course, a funny thing happens on the way to discovery. You have the Protestant Reformation, and so you have royal Christian powers who don't care what the Pope said. He restricted these bulls to particular peoples, and
really,
anyway, so you've got this free for all, and everybody's just it's just assumed within a very short span of time. It's just assumed that Christian rulers have that authority,
and that this is right. That this is like biblically, where they got this papal bull, but then you have like you said, the Reformation happened, and yet the slave trade the Reformation didn't stop the slave trade, right? I guess it accelerated. I don't know. I know history's complicated, but yeah. So accelerated. So we have, that's disturbing as a Protestant, to think about that and to think about my heritage there. So it's like, how did they get it so wrong in the Bible? I guess, was it just because it was just built on really bad theology from previous times, and it's just because you have to have a logic to it, to make sense of it. And so it's basically like, hey, ends justify the means. We're making them Christian, fulfilling the great commandment. Therefore, it's okay. Is that too simplistic, or is that the basic idea?
Yeah. As we move along, beginning with the colonization of New England, there's a racialized component to this as well. So we Anglo-Saxons. So there's this idea of Anglo-Saxon destiny that emerges in the 1800s. So when you're thinking of what you're doing in those terms, basically what's going on, and one of the things I argue in the book is that this was done intentionally and willfully. What the colonists were looking for, and this is what, in a sense, makes it such an offense. What the colonists were looking for was some way of justifying and holding civilized Englishmen innocent of any of the violence. So it gave them an easy justification. Well, we're going to take this land. They're resisting. We're going to develop it. They leave it undeveloped. And my sense is they're not thinking through really deeply. They're just, and that's the big piece.
They've gone enough to get an answer they wanted.
Like nobody does that today, right? But yeah, this is the idea. And so there's this whole warped system of denial that basically, over the course of time, weaves this narrative that the United States is not really culpable. We paid for the land, we acquired the land nobly. There were a few violent blips on the screen, but and it's just a justifying narrative that legitimates the system, that the colonial system that they're putting in place. And it really is thin. It's not theologically packed, because they're not really interested so much in and once that gets started, by the 1800s, they've internalized those interpretations, and they're unquestioned. They're just unquestioned. So you get to the point where European civilization, English culture and ways becomes the highest expression of Christianity in their own eyes, and once again join that kind of racialized perspective with really greed for land. And that's what drives it, and that's what warps the whole enterprise is greed for land to enrich an Anglo-Saxon white settler elite.
Man,
yeah,
it's just
pretty
so
nasty.
sad.
Yeah, it's nasty.
Yeah, it really is nasty. And so like when I grew up, there was this almost idealized vision of the settlers, right? They're going out there facing unbelievable hardship, right? You would take the Oregon Trail game and you would die of, what is it? Typhoid fever or dysentery or whatever, right? So all these different things. And it was a game that you would play in school. And so it was like this almost idealized sense of, hey, here's the myth of innocence, right? That's one of the things you talk about, or a settler narrative. Help us figure out what's going on there. How much of that is truth? How much of that is falsehood? Like, I know history gets complicated, but what is that settler narrative, and how do the facts of history not match it?
Yeah. Oh, so how long are we going today?
Well, 60 minutes, but as long as you, what do you need? Tell me the time you need.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I look at it is, I grew up in the 60s. And TV Westerns, movie Westerns were all the thing. And there was a pretty standard script. And so you had kind of a righteous gunslinger or a righteous frontiersman, a righteous pioneer. And you had usually some woman who was in distress, and you had a nasty villain, and you had marauding Indians and so on and so forth. So one of the things, I mean, that's part of the myth right there. That tells the story, and it also, in its own way, justifies violence. It taught people of my generation, American violence is righteous violence. Violence is necessary to bring order. So there's a whole complex of threads that weave together that form this narrative. And one of the pieces of the narrative, so as an example, you talk about the Oregon Trail. The picture that we get from the TV Westerns was, or even the novels or wherever they came from, because they were just so prominent for so long, was the fact that the Indians were just merciless and bloodthirsty and aggressive. And, the pioneers had to, brave the hardships, and they did that. And they had to endure Indian savagery and all of that. Well, a study was done probably, I think, about 20, 30 years ago. There were fewer deaths, total deaths of pioneers along the Oregon Trail due to violence. Then there were less total pioneer deaths on the Oregon Trail than in some of the larger massacres of Indigenous people. Most of the frontier violence that happened was on the white settler side, and that's the truth. And government officials and missionaries and people who were on the frontier corroborated that. So I'm in Ohio. So there was a Moravian missionary by the name of John Heckewelder who had this interesting description because he's trying to create a place of peace for the growth of his indigenous converts. But what happened would be that he would say that settlers would move in and they would encroach on Indian territory. And then they would tell him, well, when we get enough of us here, we're going to start an Indian war so that the government comes in and then we'll get this land. And he has this description of the colonial, I should say the frontier mindset. So that's one of the places where our mythology really does replace history, because and this is also acknowledged in government reports that basically say, the bulk of violence on the frontier is caused by settlers. And there are a lot of reasons why that's true, and it's corroborated, but that's this idea of the noble the gunslinger who brings order and sets everything right through violence it's still a big part of the myth. I mean, we look at all of the ways today in our movies that we glorify violence, that we sacralize violence, that we talk about or tell stories about how violence is necessary to bring order. That is the warped fruit of a toxic seed in our own national character that just glorifies violence, and it goes all the way back, all the way back. So, yeah. So,
well, yeah. Please share examples.
2 years the Pilgrims, 2 years after Plymouth, they get into a squabble with the Massachusetts. So they invite Massachusetts leaders to a parley, and when they get them there, they kill them. And there are about 4 or 5 tribal leaders, and then they take their heads and put them up on spikes around Plymouth. Now that's a story you're not going to probably read in history books, but that's the Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims.
That's the Pilgrims.
The peace-loving.
2 years.
So that is crazy. And so with were all the Pilgrims like that? Was it, because I just actually started listening to this lecture on the Great Courses from someone called America Before 1776, and it was all about like this and interestingly enough, like the only reason I know when you said the Massachusetts that it's an Indian tribe, I would have had no idea, except I just watched this thing literally like a week ago. I'm like, it's crazy that I'm like hearing this now, and it's like, so you look at them and you're like, man, the Pilgrims, like in one sense, like what was it? Is it John? The guy who basically started, was it Winthrop? Who was a Puritan?
John Winthrop, right, in Boston.
And he was Winthrop. A lawyer. Was he a lawyer? And then he started, but he was a separatist and a Puritan, right? In the sense that
right.
Yeah. So he had to leave, and he left, and he started this, and he wanted to make sure, like even the way he was describing it, like the city on the hill, like that, he wasn't saying that as if like, oh, everyone's looking and this is the shining example. That got used later, actually, in context. What the professor was saying is that the city on the hill language was that everyone's looking at us to fail. Like we're like a city on a hill, like, and he does make this kind of like biblical, but he wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a trained theologian. He was a lawyer. And essentially, he was talking about the city of Hill as a, like everyone's looking at us, they want us to fail, and like they're staring at us and just waiting for us to fail. But then, like watching like what they did with Merrimack, right? What they went and Marymount. That's what it is. Marymount, where they took a military force and kicked these guys out because they were profligate and whatever it is, the language that they would use. And so you see Pilgrims and you imagine peaceful, but they weren't peaceful. But were they all bad, or was it like, I guess like good and bad? I mean, I guess it's always a mix, isn't it?
Right. Well, you have Pilgrims and you have Puritans, and they're different.
Gotcha. So, right. I guess that's true.
So
right.
So the Puritans are actually still Church of England folk, but But here's the piece with Boston. So since you bring up the
Yes,
city on the
yes.
hill, that particular speech, it didn't really it just didn't really catch on with the Puritans. So he he uh, he wrote that sermon as they're waiting to this flotilla of 11 ships is sitting in the harbor, getting ready to answer. But anyway, so there wasn't that much kind of impact.
Right.
The greater impact was a sermon on them, was a sermon that they heard as they prepared to embark from Southampton in 1630. And that was preached by one of the leaders of the Puritans by the name of John Cotton. And he wanted them to have
Yes.
a biblical idea, of a biblical image, to know how to move forward, how to see God's hand at work. And so he just went through and said, here's how you know where to go. Here's how you know that God is with you and doing what is right. So the scripture tells us that when God gets ready to do a new work and plant a new people in a new place, God first of all discovers, and he uses the discovery language. And then God discovers a place, and then God provides a way to carry them to that place. And then finally, God guides them to some vacant land where they can settle. And vacant land in the Puritan mind was land that was not owned. So yeah, if nobody owns it, then it's available for anybody to take. And of course, the indigenous peoples of the area didn't have any concept of owning the land.
Right.
They were caring for the land. They were taking care. They were stewarding the land. So to answer your question directly, in terms of did everybody think this? It's hard to say, and there are dissenters. There are people who are really not going with the program. So, for example, in 1637, the Puritan colonies are really concerned that the Pequots, another area tribe, is going to attack them. So they decide that they're going to launch a preemptive strike on a fortified village of about 400 to 700 people, and so they've got that military force. And there's a really interesting note from one of the journals of one of the people that went there, and they talk about how Puritan preachers were preaching sermons to these soldiers as they surrounded the city. They were preparing to attack it at the first light of dawn, but you had preachers coming around and letting them know that what they were doing was biblical and in God's will. Which, if they had to send preachers around to make that point, then obviously there are a significant number of people who are having qualms about what eventually happened, which is slaughtering 400 to 500 men, women, and children.
Man. And so it's just so hard, because you see, like, it's so hard to look at this and see that that they took Christian concepts and they brought it into this end, and it's
yeah.
And I guess, like, was there provocation from the, like, what part did the indigenous people play in this?
Yeah.
The natives, what part did they play? Again, I am not trying to say in any way that what happened, like, justify it or say.
Right.
It's really trying to understand it, really. Like, even thinking about, like, they, like, just that thing you said about they thought about buying the land versus the natives had no concept that you owned land. Just that very idea right there. that lack of communication, that lack of understanding, that lack of like basic shared understanding of value or how the world works created, I'm sure, unbelievable amounts of conflict and misunderstanding. And I guess what I'm trying to like, I just trying to understand the whole thing. And
sure.
How did the indigenous people respond in this? And another thing, a question, well, I'll stop there because I have a question about disease and wondering what you think about that played in it, but go ahead.
That's a good kind of, again, there's this, I'll just put it simply. Greed is the driver. And
that makes sense.
As the Boston colonies expand, they just need more land. And so initially they're buying it fairly, but later on they're using all kinds of I would say ungodly ways of relating to get that land. It's really hard to generalize, but I'll put it this way: the MO from the colonial period onward is preemptive strike during the winter.
Interesting.
Often, so that we can destroy their food sources, so any survivors will starve to death or will be forced to come to us for food. And that goes all the way through Western expansion. And so, yes, there are also cases where indigenous peoples rise up themselves. There's a huge uprising. Uprising is a bad name, but there's a huge war that is precipitated in Virginia. It kills 1 out of 5 Virginia settlers before the indigenous forces are subdued. But really, there are those instances, but the number and scope
is far less,
pale in comparison with the level of violence meted out by people who bore the name of Christ. And that's
just awful.
The thing that we've got to I think we've got to reconcile with.
Absolutely.
We as white, because it's a sin that we know how repressed sin works. It doesn't just fade away.
No, it doesn't.
And we've never, first of all, as a church, as a religion, as a community of faith, we've never acknowledged really the full complicity that we've had with these colonial projects, the greed that a lot of our Christian forebears came with and that propelled them. And we haven't really addressed significantly enough the way that's warped our own Christianity in its social expressions. I could go on, but here's a quick footnote.
Please.
So here's one of the ways that we that we spin it. Generally, if there was a mass killing by colonials who killed, struck defenseless, peaceful indigenous people, it was usually called a battle. So, the battle of this, the battle of that. But if there was a situation where indigenous people killed maybe 3 or 4 settlers, that's a massacre. And so it's just this, even in the way that we name what happened,
right?
Just feeds into this narrative that where we deny to ourselves and others our deep implication with this colonial script and what it's produced in us, the kinds of divisions, the infatuation with violence, the racial antagonism. I mean, they all have roots.
Yeah, I mean, that makes, I I was kind of pausing there because it definitely makes sense. I mean, it's like the story I'm hearing is that there was essentially built into the policy of colonialism of a willingness to take anything by force, whatever's needed, and violence, a and then a concomitant justification of those violent acts through some kind of authoritative declarations and the use of clergy and the use of church and religion to try to essentially sanitize what was going on or sacralize even violence and what was happening, that they were doing this and this was the right thing, actually fulfilling God's mission by doing this. And so you have that driving, and greed is really behind us to gain more land, gain more power, get more space. And so you have these essentially that the settlers are the aggressors. They are the ones, like they set the pattern. Is that correct? What I'm hearing?
Yeah, they wrote the script. And that script developed over decades and centuries, and then it's just internalized. I mean, I never questioned. It never even occurred to me when I was growing up to ask why the indigenous people that we learned about or that we talked about in Boy Scouts or whatever, why they weren't here and we were. I mean, it was invisible to me.
It was invisible, and we don't. I think, right? Most people, most Americans, certainly, I think most white Americans have no clue the sophistication of the peoples and the cultures and everything, and even the population and of course the millions and millions of people in North America and in Central America, not to mention things like the Aztec and Mayan and then Incan, right? Massive empires, these unbelievable empires that essentially were able to be, and this is kind of like what I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, like essentially a major reason from what I've heard and what I've seen that Europe could even come do this, especially in like Central America. I know you're focused on Northern America, was because of disease. That it essentially, I heard some things like certain diseases, like one of the voyages that John Smith was on, it wiped out 70 to 80% of the native population on the coast in this area. I mean, 70, 80%, like that's apocalyptic, right? So it's like, and then like in the Mayan and Incan and Aztec, 90%, some estimates, 90% of the people, 9 out of 10 people died from disease, not even to mention the violence, right? So it's like, what place did disease have in this, and how was that understood by the settlers?
Yeah, that's I don't know that I really have a good, clear answer to that. I know there's a debate.
It's okay.
So same in New England. So probably about 90% of the Massachusetts people were wiped out by some kind of disease, smallpox.
That destabilization there's just no way that we could have gone as fast, I guess, as without disease. Would you say that's correct? Like we actually were able to do it probably mostly because of disease.
That was part of it, because you have whole social structures that are just completely gone. And so what do you do? And then it starts a cycle, because colonial practices just weaken and destabilize indigenous societies, and it makes them in turn more susceptible to European disease. And so there's quite a debate about what role disease played. And you've got some folks on the one extreme saying, well, that's just an excuse. And you've got, for for taking your eye off the real issue that we have to deal with, which is the violence and the mendacity of
Right. And
treaties.
we don't want to take our eyes off that
yeah.
issue necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are the others that say, well, yeah, look, this had to play a huge role in
I mean, it just had to, right?
yeah, how we were able to, how white settlers were able to advance. Yeah, there are whole books about how that affected the Western advance.
Absolutely. And I just wondered, did you see anything about how Christians interpreted those diseases? Did they see them as God working for them or something like that? Or do we not really have a lot of any stuff on that?
All I can say is I've done quite a bit of reading over the course of a couple of decades, and that really I haven't come across that kind of anything that would suggest that some element in the settler society is saying, well, this is a good thing because we're going to get the land easier, or B, this is God's punishment. I really haven't. Doesn't mean that they're there. I just haven't encountered it.
That's so interesting. I just feel like I just wonder because of it had to be just a massive impact it had. But the point that you made though is important because regardless of all of that and how horrific that is, regardless of all that, the point that Christians literally took this and they baptized all of this in Christian theology and language and thinking and mission.
Yeah. And
never to take our eyes off the fact that these horrific things were done in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
Which is so hard. Go ahead.
It is. I was just saying the same. It's why this book was really difficult to write.
I'm sure
it was just overwhelming.
So for someone who's sitting here and they're hearing this and they're thinking, well, I mean, whatever, I've heard things about the savagery of some of the native practices and you've made the point that they didn't, like, the scale was nothing like it. And again, this was their home that we were coming in and essentially invading. We can't, the same people that might think that, the settlers did the right thing wouldn't look kindly on someone coming in and trying to invade their home and take them out, and would probably respond violently to something like that, or with force. And so it's like, obviously we're looking at this and it's just heartbreaking for someone though who's like, I don't know, I'm not convinced it was really all that bad. Could you give some of the examples that you have of maybe some of the more disturbing things that you saw that were done in the name of Jesus, just to give maybe some people some examples, like how can you have any reason to say that Jesus could be behind this?
Yeah. I think so there's a sense in which a lot of the folks who did this, we would call them nominal Christians, if that.
Right.
I don't. You do have people that are really pushing back out of a sense of kind of Christian revulsion, who are saying this is not right, this is not the way. But most of these people, went to church and they would have called themselves Christians. So one of the examples that I think is particularly grievous and difficult, and it's another situation in Ohio, is again the Moravian. So there were Moravian converts, and they established a number of villages in what is now southeast Ohio, and they're Christians. And so this is during the Revolutionary War. They didn't want to take a side. They actually moved into Ohio so they didn't have to be pulled into the conflict. They just wanted to, they just wanted to live in peace, and they were they were prosperous communities. Anyway, long story short, they were forced from their homes and taken up near where Toledo, Ohio is now by the tribal, one of the chiefs from the Lenape. And they just had a hard time kind of getting enough to eat. So they were given permission to go back to their storehouses, their fields, their villages, and just get the food that was in the storehouses. It was in the spring, bring it back. And while they were there, a contingent of colonial militia from Pennsylvania arrived on the scene, and they had been wanting to avenge the death of a settler family. And they really were. They were out for blood. So they decided that they wanted to investigate this settlement. And so they came in, they disarmed everybody of what few weapons they had for hunting. They found some European style cooking implements, and they said, well, they wouldn't have these unless they stole them. And so they eventually had a meeting, and they decided we got to kill them. So 96, they took them all into one of the common buildings, and they said, we've decided that we're going to put you to death. You're lying. You've been colluding with the Indian forces, so on and so forth. And they said, would you give us the night to prepare our souls? And they put the women and children in one cabin, the men in another, and they sang hymns and prayed all night. And these are Christian brothers and sisters. And in the morning, they were taken out 2 by 2 into another building, and their skulls were smashed in with heavy mallets, 2 by 2. And the great majority of those people were women and children.
And the women and children were praying?
Yeah. Yeah, they were in another building.
See, yeah. They were Christians.
They were Christians, and they were pacifist Christians. They were Christians who did not want to get involved in the violence, so they moved as far away as they could, but they just couldn't move far enough, evidently.
Jeez. And so were they Native Americans or no?
These were Native Americans. They were
okay. They were Native Americans that were Christian pacifists. I just want to make sure that everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So these they had become Christian through the ministry of some Moravian missionaries, and they were creating Christian villages of respect, and from all accounts, they were just model Christian, a model Christian community. They just happened to be Lenape, Muncie, Mohican.
It just makes like it. Yeah, there aren't really words, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, especially to read the accounts. It's tough.
So it is so heavy. And how do you separate like this idea of Christian complicity, right, from the claim that Christianity is inherently colonial? And I'm separating colonial from inherently a missionary religion, in the sense that, right, we have the missionaries of the early church, although I know that the way that these communities grew after the apostolic age, right, between that was not with evangelism as we think about it.
Right.
because it was essentially illegal
Right.
and within the Roman government or Roman Empire. And so, but how do you separate that? Because I'm a Christian, you're a Christian. We love Jesus. This isn't the Jesus we serve. Is absolutely horrified. I don't know what I mean. This kind of stuff. How do we deal with this? I guess maybe that's what I'm saying.
Well, we deal with it first of all by being willing to deal with it.
Yeah,
Um,
being willing to be
and
honest about it.
yeah, and 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 to recognize that in the Western European colonial project, Christianity and Christian civilization are fused.
They
They are
can't be separated.
they are inseparable. So, um, yeah, it's so Christianity becomes the way that we erase indigenous identities. We tell them that they're all under the domain of Satan and they've got to be saved. They're all sinners, and really some of the most grievous effects on Native communities came through actually Christians who wanted to do the right thing. And so they got them into boarding houses and they thought they knew what was right and took children as young as 4 years old and took them away from their families, put them into boarding schools and tried to make them into United Christians and American citizens. And you'll read the literature. I mean, and that begins in the early 1800s. So, to respond to what you're saying, I mean, one of the things we have to realize is that at least in the case of European colonialism, there is a fusion that does not respect indigenous cultures, that does not respect indigenous people, that did not respect the customs and values and that indigenous people had. Didn't appreciate the vibrancy of their cultures. And so what's happening now, in a kind of to use a word that has a little bit of freight, but I'll just use it anyway, in a post-colonial kind of environment, is that we have Christians around the world who were converted by the efforts of godly missionaries. But they were basically told in order to be Christian, you also have to adopt these cultural forms and frameworks and ways of thinking and so on and so forth. And what's happening now around the world is that people are beginning to think differently and to ask the question about how Christianity can be faithfully incarnated within the context of their own cultures.
Yes.
As opposed to having to, abandon their culture in order to be Christian. So, there's a residue here that we've got to deal with in terms of our missions, and not to blame or shame. I mean that blame and shame does nothing good. It just turns us inside of ourselves. But just in a way of saying, let's try to rebuild. Let's listen. Let's hear. Let's talk. Let us know how we can assist you. We thank you and they do. I mean, around the world, they're grateful for the missionaries who brought Christ to them, but they also recognize that the forms and the practice, some of the practices and cultural conventions didn't really fit them, and their own cultures were demeaned and demonized. And so, the question is how it seems from the colonized is, how do we kind of decolonize and throw off this kind of colonial association with Christianity so that we can live together as an expression of the body of Christ that is within the context of our own cultural ways of thinking and norms and practices and culture, it seems to be that's really what we should be doing.
Yes, it definitely is what we should be doing. How do you recommend like the normal person who's listening to the podcast and they heard about the book? Obviously, we want them to read the book, but what would you say for them? Like, what are some next steps for them if they're like, yeah, I feel horrified, I can't believe that happened in the name of Jesus. Like, I want to be, I want to make a difference, or I don't ever want anything like that to happen again, or whatever it may be. Like, what would you say is the next step for them? How would you encourage them?
Yeah, well, in a number of ways. One is simply to learn, to maybe to read, to read. There's a lot of good literature that's really lifting things up and helping us to see things more clearly. So you and I were talking a little bit earlier about Chris Huckletubby and Danny Zacharias is reading the
Yes.
Bible on Turtle Island. I mean, it's a wonderful book.
Yes.
And just reacquainting yourself with a different way of thinking and
Yes.
interpreting and believing is a good positive step. So learning about how the national story plays out in your own locality. Who were the people who stewarded the land before colonists came in? Where are they now? What happened? What role did we play? What influence does that past have on the way that we've constructed our communities here? And then there are so many organizations now, people that really care, who are moved by this kind of sense of urgency to let's put the colonial script in the dustbin. Let's acknowledge. So, I mean, just having the openness to say, I can enter into a different space. I want to learn. I want to listen. I want to grow, and then I want to know how to stand with my Indigenous brothers and sisters. What are the issues that are that they're dealing with, and what can I do? Finally, a final thing is just to take the time to experience Indigenous cultures. Go to some powwows, visit an Indian center when they've got a program on, and just because, and that's particularly important because white settler society has put a lot of energy into maintaining the invisibility of Indigenous people. And so just taking intentional steps to recognize and honor them as good gifts to our church and to our country, and learning about them, listening, all of those are, I think, really important first steps.
Well, I think that's all really good. And I think a first step for everyone is to go pick up this book. If you're watching this, right, and it's a reel, listen to the podcast, then go pick up the book, and then take that, like the reading from Turtle Island, First Nations version. There's a lot of stuff out there that you can start to get involved with and take those next steps. And we're going to encourage everyone to do that. Dan, thanks so much for being on the program. How can people connect with you if you want them to? Is there a preferred vendor for the book? What projects do you have coming up?
Well, yeah, I could be contacted at my seminary email address at dhawk@ashland.edu. I have a pretty robust Facebook page, do a lot of writing and conversing and along these lines on that page, and there's usually a really good dialogue. So that's another way. Just get in and kind of, if you don't quite know what to do, enter this or another space where people are having these conversations and thinking, praying and thinking together about how we can write a new script for our church and our nation that values all voices and values all cultures and values all experience.
I love that. Well, again, thank you so much, Dan, for spending time, giving us your time and your insights.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much again for helping me get the word out.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, guys, thanks for joining us. Send this to someone who needs to hear it, someone that you know would be interested in this. Let's keep working together to get civil conversations about tough topics out there. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Thanks.